All right, so we're live. Hello, everybody. This is Thomas. This is ONOS TST meeting. It's a live and publicly recorded meeting. So today we have two items on the agenda. One of them is just a brief review and planning of the ONOS Classic releases, the one that we just released, which is 2.4, and one that we're embarking on, which is 2.5, and it's codenamed Velociraptor. And then the second item on the agenda is a discussion of some enhancements to the onos-config that are required in order for onos-config to serve its central role in Ether architecture. Let's start with the first one, which is the Velociraptor planning. It's ONOS 2.5. There we go. So the release, as you know, we've moved to 6-month cycle releases. So the release is slated to be done in the beginning of December, specifically December 4th. And backing from that, a couple of weeks, the feature freeze will be in middle of November. And then kind of the first, and I guess the only milestone review will be at the end of September this year. All of these dates have been entered on the ONOS calendar. So you can, if you follow the ONOS calendar, you should be able to see them there. And I'll be sending out prior notifications as we get near those dates. So the primary kind of the major themes of this upcoming release is just basically keep ONOS Classic in a kind of a maintenance mode, in a cruise mode, where we're going to be keeping track of evolving third-party dependencies so that we can stay up to date. The idea is not to fall too far behind here. And to maintain the build toolchain and infrastructure. And this is primarily to support application development, both new applications as well as existing applications. One of the major changes, and Charles will talk about it, will be split of trellis and related apps from the monorepo. And then we also want to make sure that we integrate the deployment via Helm and Kubernetes with the newly evolving micro-ONOS applications. And then the rest of the effort really of the team will be focused on evolving the micro-ONOS components, specifically enhancing the ONOS topo and its APIs so that we can accommodate the RAN use case. And clearly associated with that will be also really primarily developing the ONOS-RIC implementation to also support the SD-RAN use case. So Charles, you want to talk more about the separating of the trellis applications?
Right. This is a task coming up from the Ether discussion. So the motivation of doing this, there are two of them. So the first one is we want to let trellis be evolved, version and release independently from ONOS. And also we want to lower the development bar of trellis by minimizing the code and the build process. So the plan here is to extract 2 of the trellis apps, sim routing and T3, from ONOS master, which will become 2.5. To separate repos, trellis control and trellis T3. And we're going to document a new build process based on Maven. It will be very similar to any other external ONOS apps we have today. And the plan for Ether is that Ether will stay with latest LTS 2.2 until 2.5 is out by the end of this year. I haven't heard about the plan from the SIVA team, but at this moment they're on 2.2 as well. So that's all for me.
It makes sense, yeah. Yeah, so we can probably work out the specific timeline with the other programs to when they want to move to the 2.5, or whether we can, modify the release date slightly or release some intermittent versions. Yeah.
Okay, maybe let me clarify a little bit. So the separation of the code base is going to happen recently. So we're going to take trellis out from master, and then it can be compiled as a individual ONOS apps. The plan is that even 2.5 hasn't been released yet, we can still take that code and run it on top of the release ONOS version, which is 2.2. I think it is possible because I don't think there are that many API changes these days, but it still has to be tested.
Yes, agreed. Yep. That makes perfect sense. So one thing that I kind of forgot to mention in the preamble was that even though we didn't really specifically plan this before, I think 2.5 will end up being an LTS. One of the reasons, and this will be one of the reasons, is because that will be now one of the major apps, or a couple of the major apps, will be absent from the distribution, and we want to make sure that, and also we will require fairly deep testing of after the separation. So it makes sense for it to be long-term support release. That is not, we haven't really voted on this yet, but it seems to be, I think that seems to be kind of a trend towards that. And also, just to add a comment on the Basel versus Maven, clearly I think I completely agree with the decision to move to Maven, because especially with the apps now not being part of the monorepo, there's very little benefit to be derived from continuing with Basel. And I think this will also, like you said, will go towards the lowering the development bar for the developers. So yeah, I think this is a good move. Thanks, Charles. Ray, do you want to go over some of the core stuff? Maybe with Jordan?
Sure. Well, most of this work was done by other people, but
Oh, okay. Oh, that's right, Sean.
Sean, why don't you talk about Basilisk a little bit? Let's start with that.
Really Basilisk, just a very simple little addition. It's an installation tool for Basel, and fortunately it came along and sorted out a big problem we had in the build. So basically, when we were building on Jenkins, many of the builds were crashing for really unknown reasons, some kind of race condition. And so what we wanted to do was ensure a particular version of Basel was used for a particular version of ONOS. And the Basilisk came along, and you treat it as a direct substitute for Basel, and it goes off and it downloads the correct version. It keeps them in a cache, and it looks in the repo for a .basel version. So as far as it came to Jenkins, we changed the build, and so it uses Basilisk to pull down the right version, and we cached it on there as well on the build machine, and thankfully now those errors have stopped. So this was something that was very hard to find, and very thankful to find a solution to it in the end. I think the next slide might be mine too, Thomas.
Yep.
So this was really just about the GUI. There were a few bugs raised, I think, by Carmelo in relation to the NGSDN tutorial, and fixed a few of those and closed a few obsolete issues, but no major contributions on micro-ONOS in this, in classic ONOS in this release.
Yeah. So quick question, Sean, here while we're in the GUI. Do you think we should, at this point in time, consider completely eliminating the GUI 1?
I think it's only from a maintenance point of view that it can become a problem. So it's stopping us from moving on to a newer version of Node.js, but it's not really a problem at the moment. I think version 10.16 is as high as we can go without having to upgrade GUI 1. I'd say but maybe by the end of this release, Thomas, it might be time to phase it out, and we can poll people and just make sure that is the case. But I think by the end of this release, phase it out, because I think it would simplify the build a bit as well. I know there's a Jenkins build.
That was precisely. I'm not really concerned too much with the code just lying in place, but primarily just being a liability from the infrastructure standpoint, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it does add a lot of extra time to the builds. So I would definitely be in favor of, if no one's using it, at least dropping it from the build components. Yeah.
Well, at least dropping the test of it from the build would be something we could do straight away. I mean, it's been tested, every day for the last 3 years without any changes being made to it. So I think we could do that straight away, and then I think if we maybe we could extract this into its own repo, it wouldn't be a big would it be worth the effort really of putting it in its own repo? I think maybe by the end of this year, we would phase it out.
Okay, so I think what I'm going to, I'm just going to make a note here. I'm going to handle this separately. I'll send out a basically message announcing our plans to deprecate the GUI 1 entirely by the end of this release. We can then decide on a specific strategy, but I think at this point in time, I would like to pursue one that involves the minimum amount of effort on our part, which would probably mean uncoupling it from the build, perhaps leaving the code in there just for the time being, and declaring our intention possibly to completely remove the code after 2.5. I think that would probably be the simplest, in a sense that we wouldn't have to spend the energy on putting in a separate repo, because I think that would probably end up being more work than we think. And at the same time, we would accomplish the goal of not holding back the remnants of our infrastructure, and also, basically generating excess heat by running the test of code that doesn't evolve.
Yeah.
Okay, so that sounds good. And then also second question, and since we're pretty much at the end, I think, second question, so with regards to Basel, do we see any new major releases of Basel coming up that might throw some wrinkles? Seems like the stability has been improved, so that even if new versions are coming up, we're really not affected very much. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we have. I mean, we can leave 2.5 on Basel 3.0. And we know that works. And unless I think there are new features in Basel, future versions of Basel, we should probably leave it at 3.0 until we have a good reason to move.
Yeah, my point is, I just want to make sure we kind of strike the right balance between not upgrading for the upgrade's sake, but also at the same time, on the other hand, not falling too far behind, because the step across multiple versions can prove to be a challenge later. That's all.
This is true. Yeah, this is true. I guess we can add that to the. I think there's a 3.2 version out now, so we could at least try and target 3.2 in the 2.5 time frame then.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that's primarily it for the 2.4 and 2.5 release planning. Clearly, most of the effort will be in the applications, and we didn't get contributors to outside of ONF to kind of state their intention. So I assume the platform itself can just continue to cruise in the maintenance mode while we invest our time in developing micro-onos. So I think we can probably close this item. And Sean, do you want, and move on to the other one. Sean, do you want to share, or?
You can share, Thomas, if you want. I think it's just the TST slide pack. Okay. I don't know if you have the link.
Yeah, I'll find it. It will be in here.
Exactly.
Sounds great.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you can put it into presentation mode. There's only
sure.
8 short slides here.
Everybody can still see it?
I can anyway. This was about onos-config. We've talked a good bit recently about ROC, which is a component of Ether, which is a member-only project. But onos-config is a public project, and that's why I'm bringing this to the public TST meeting here. So there's a few things in onos-config that need to be added. So the list starts, I guess, with role-based access control. So identifying users, you know, what users have the authority to do certain things, change the configuration, and also, you know, we need to log it and make it clear who made what change and have a history of changes as well. And I have a couple of slides on that. Network-wide constraints. So basically, currently we only apply validation to changes at the device level or application level, if you want. So this is basically about referential integrity across multiple devices, which is seen as an important requirement as well. Multi-tenancy, so basically the possibility of having multiple tenants having their configuration in one instance. How do we separate them? I have a slide on that. And then the subject of hardening of onos-config from a test and security perspective, and you know, automatic generation of certs and so on. How we do initialization of onos-config is something that needs attention. How we migrate, and then the subject of adapters, mediators, synchronizers, call them what you want. They're basically additional microservices that are needed to control various devices and applications in different protocols. And then there's a slide at the end that I think Ray and Jordan added in about technical data on onos-config that we should address in this push as well. So next slide then, please, Thomas. So RBAC from the perspective of GNMI is not something really that's built in. Role-based access control, so comprises really of 3 things: authentication, authorization, and accounting. I think are the AAA acronym. So I think watching a few guides on this, there's the approach seems to be is that the client identifies the user, and the client here could be another application, maybe the CLI or the GUI. So they prompt the user for a username and password, and then they pass that to an OpenID provider, such as Dex or Keycloak, and these are two microservices that can be run on Kubernetes to provide that OpenID service, and they can be linked on to further OpenIDs. They can really act as a proxy, so you could connect this to so that when a user goes in and tries to identify themselves in the GUI, that they get the option to use their Google ID or their Facebook ID or LinkedIn or whatever like this, you know. So that's we're kind of familiar with seeing those kind of things on web pages now, and I think that's the kind of level of OpenID authentication I'm talking about here. So what happens is the OpenID server sends back a Java or a JSON web token, which is a standardized way of representing an authorization or an authentication, I mean. So basically that JWT consists of like a secret, like an encrypted part, but also some data as well. And the username is passed in with that data as the JWT, and it's passed over to the gRPC and the metadata for the call. Okay.
Sean, a quick about the OpenID.
Yeah.
I understand how this works in the context of GUIs and web services. What about either a northbound system that's just using an API or a command line tool? Are there programmatic?
Yeah, there are libraries. Yeah, there are libraries in most languages to connect to the OpenIDE. So there's an API and a library that you can include in your application to do this kind of thing.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
And it's like there is an RFC, so like it's well standardized and well known. Okay, so then there's the subject of user or group or role mapping. So there's Kubernetes has the concept of cluster role and role inside a namespace that it uses in its own RBAC. Its own RBAC really is about checking your authority to run a Kubernetes API call. So basically that's not something that applies to our gRPCs, but the role is reusable and it's something that can be leaned on for this. So for instance here, I was thinking like there could be two basic roles that are always there. One would be a read-only and the other would be allow everything. So for instance, if maybe you don't present a username or a JWT, you might be able to still do read-only or read-only to a restricted part. We'll have to decide what those roles mean. And then you can add maybe, we've come up with a YAML file to specify other roles. So say for instance, like, you know, I don't know, a super user role or, you know, an admin role or whatever like this, you know, so many others could be specified. So basically in onos-config then there's the set. Sorry, in GNMI there are three main verbs. So one is set, the other is get, and the other is subscribe. And so, for instance, the set is the important one to handle here. And so, authorization here is on the verb, and it happens before the point of validating that your payload is even correct. Okay, so basically, if the request fails on the authorization bit, you reject with a good reason and make it clear to the user that why they're being rejected. And log the failed attempt, and this acts as an audit, I think. If it succeeds, log it again and make your network change and tag the network change with the username that made the change as well, so that it's clear to user interface, you know, who made what change and so on like this. And there's a very good slide pack and YouTube video on this securing gRPC commands as KubeCon 19. So on the next slide, Thomas, I'm continuing with RBAC just to drill down a little bit into the GNMI side of things. So I think RBAC can be applied at 4 levels, and I think we probably wouldn't do all 4 levels at the start. I think we'd probably just do maybe the first 2 at the start. So basically, you could have it on the gRPC verb level. So for instance, that get and subscribe might be allowed for all, but set is only allowed for somebody who has like super user role. And the second stage of that then might be to subdivide the set. So for instance, like inside set, the payload has a certain number of things to create, a certain number of things to update, and a certain number of deletes. Well, you know, maybe the role would go to the level of specifying that, yeah, you're allowed to update, but you're not allowed to delete, for instance, whereas a further user might be allowed to do the delete. So you can take it further still down, and you can have permissions on a Yang object basis. So for instance, like interface, you know, are you allowed to create an interface? Are you allowed to set the time zone? You know, these kind of things that at the Yang object permission. So, I mean, that kind of thing has to be done in the model plugin because really that's where the information about the Yang leaves are. So, you know, there can be various structures and rules there, but I think that's maybe a kind of an advanced case and something maybe we would look at in Q4 maybe, or into next year, depending on what the requirements of ROC turn out to be. And then the fourth level would be that you might have per device permissions, you know, so that like you might be allowed to make a change on device 1 but not device 2 or something like this. I don't know. I mean, these are I think is probably as far as you could take it. And also there are other RPCs on onos-config as well, like there's admin and diags, and these allow you to see what the network changes were and things like that. And, you know, you could apply the same level of, like level 1 here, gRPC verb level authorization, against those. And in fact, you could take this kind of structure if it can be implemented successfully, as I showed on the previous page, and you could apply it to various gRPCs on, I don't know, other modules like ONOS Topo or ONOS RIC or anything at all like this. You know, you could bring that authorization once we have a model for it. I think we can reuse that verb level authentication or authorization as on other modules too. Okay, so that was it from the RBAC. So on the network-wide constraints thing, then, so I think this is a completely separate piece of work, but I think it's pretty easy if we just keep it as simple like this. And I know other requirements may come up that may require a second approach, but I think you know, what we're looking for is referential integrity, and so basically I think we need something flexible and that can be changed on a per installation basis. So I wouldn't bake it into the Yang. What I would do is I think I'd come up with a YAML file that's loaded in to a config map for the onos-config, and basically just lay out what are all the leaves in the model, and then basically have rules on those, and Yang provides a nice rule called a must rule. And so what it means is that when the configuration is applied, this rule must be satisfied. So it's not about I'm deleting an interface, therefore I must delete. Therefore, there's a knock-on effect of deleting something else. What we're talking about here is you, in your network change, you delete the interface, you delete the other dependent thing, and if you forget to delete the other dependent thing, the must rule is not valid, and so you'll get an error. So that's how validation works in onos-config, and that was my point here, that it's applied during validation. So you go off and you validate that the config is right for each individual device or application, and then you apply this on top of it to validate that the net result of the network change satisfies both the individual devices and these network-wide constraints. And so if that network configuration is not valid, reject with a good error message explaining what the problem was. And like in this case, like I say, deletes are not handled separately. It's really what's the end result? Is the end result after you've made your network change valid? And really it's an extension of how the Yang is validated then. So basically, like I said, I see it being something that can vary at deploy time. So I think it should be loaded through the Helm chart, and is something that, you know, a customer can configure, and maybe a bit of a tool for generating this kind of thing as well, of validating that the rules are correct.
Quick question here, Sean. So I can definitely see that this would work for be able to enforce rules kind of within the, you know, across a model, but still within the kind of the totality of the models maintained by the onos-config. Quick question.
Yeah.
I don't think this would be able to accommodate potentially referential integrity with respect to foreign keys, which is possibly with respect to let's say identifiers or pieces of data that may have ties to information stored elsewhere.
Yeah, this is a solution completely inside onos-config,
right.
but
So,
yeah, I mean,
I guess
Go
my
ahead,
point is, I think this, while it would definitely be valuable to implement this particular mechanism as potentially as a kind of a first pass, I think we may also need to be open to implementing potentially or having some sort of at least hooks for evaluating the validity of the model kind of in more arbitrary way, but leaving the logic of the actual evaluation to be entirely open. Basically having like some sort of hooks in place, you know,
Right.
I've done this, let me know how it looks to you, type of a thing. And the you here would be clearly some sort of deployment wide, but deployment specific logic.
Yeah, that could be an addition to it. Yeah, for sure, that could be an addition.
I'm not saying we should do it, but we should at least. It would be interesting to see what Scott thinks with respect to whether this mechanism alone that you presented in here would suffice. Then clearly we all just ought to do that, and don't worry about what I said. But I have a suspicion that I think this will probably not meet what Scott has in mind. Scott, do you have?
Sure. So what I had in mind, I think, is what Sean described, which was referential integrity between models with onos-config. So two different models that one of them has a key that points to the other.
Okay, great.
It sounds like what you're describing is integrity to models outside of onos-config.
Or to other information elsewhere, yeah. So I thought maybe, so that's good, then maybe I misunderstood what you had originally asked for. And so if you can get away with just this, that's great.
Yeah, so I mean, the latter does sound useful that you described, Thomas, but it does seem like that would all have to be written with custom code because, I mean, only the developer coding it knows what an identifier that points outside of onos-config would point to and how to validate it.
Correct.
But
if you don't have a need for it, I'm not at all suggesting that we do it just because it would be useful sometime down the road. We clearly want to do only the work that's necessary for Ether. And so if this meets your need, that's great, actually.
Yeah, I think this meets the needs I had in mind, but you made me think of maybe I want more things.
Oh, sorry, Sean. Please
well,
yeah, so
I think
we'll keep an eye out for places where that would be useful. But I mean, we can only do so much with validation, and at some point, it does become the administrator's responsibility to not enter syntactically correct garbage into the system, you know.
Okay. Well,
yeah, I mean, what I had guided me on this is basically we were trying to come up with something equivalent to what XOS has in terms of referential integrity, and like it has a Postgres database there, and really the referential integrity is just inside the database as far as I understand.
well, perfect. I guess I was reading the Scott's requirements a little bit probably more loosely, but this is great. We can just stick to this, and I apologize for taking on that tangent.
No, that's absolutely fine. Okay, you can go on to the next slide then.
Just one question, Sean, back to that slide. This also applies to deletes.
Yeah, it does. It does. And remember, I think the point I'm making, Scott, is that it's not. It's really a validation action. So really, it's not about doing the delete for you. I think what I'm saying is that your delete should be in your network change, and this validates this rule is a rule that checks yes, you are doing a delete while you're doing a primary action as well. Is that okay?
Yeah, just
Maybe
to
I'm
make
not clear.
Well, just to make sure I mean, I need to familiarize myself with onos-config, but the ultimate goal is just that you can't create dangling pointers. If you have a pointer from A to B and you delete B, that would be a violation on object A that it still has a pointer to B. So as long as that case is covered.
It's covered, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay. Okay, so the subject of multi-tenancy then. So really, I don't think we have like a very clear definition of how it applies to onos-config at present. So, you know, I think there's simple multi-tenancy, and you know, this might be something as simple as, you know, maybe we have individual instances of onos-config inside the namespace. So maybe we could partition things at this level and aggregate them at a higher level. That would be very simple in one way. It's simple to achieve, but you know, maybe it creates a nightmare in another way, because now you have to manage many instances of onos-config. You know, on the other hand, you might have a complex multi-tenancy where you know, you want you know, a network change, you know, to have a part configuration. Say, for instance, you have a device, right? And you have one device and it's serving many of your tenants. Now you have a change that, you know, you can, one tenant might want to configure something on it, and then another tenant comes along and they want to configure something else on it. When we have device changes inside onos-config, they're linear. They sit on top of each other, and like if the tenant is deleted, you know, you want to be able to pull out those things belonging to that tenant. You know, so I think that would be something that I couldn't really see how it's achieved on onos-config today. I think we'd have to brainstorm these things a bit more when we come up with what the exact requirements are. But you know, like the other point of multi-tenancy is that really it's at the periphery of the system that the multi-tenancy needs to be applied. You know, the data inside can sit side by side. You know, I mean, if you take into account maybe the bank's holding of your bank account details, they sit right alongside all the other customers inside the bank's IT system. It's not until you get to the periphery of the system that it stops you from seeing what your neighbor's bank account has inside in it. So, you know, I think if we apply this at the portal level, or applied it at, you know, some other user interface level, then, you know, maybe you solve multi-tenancy in that way at a level higher than onos-config.
Yeah, I think it needs to be applied at whatever the API level is that's going to serve the portals and potentially command line tools and potentially external API users.
Right.
Because we do imagine the enterprise may implement their own tool to interact with either that doesn't necessarily go through the GUI. So we will need to enforce at that API boundary. But I agree with you. It needs to be, you know, the boundary at the periphery of either. We don't need to enforce RBAC at every stage. Is kind of an end-to-end argument, you know.
Yeah.
Only when we leave.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what that might mean is that we, you know, maybe for the portal there's an API level above the onos-config GNMI API. You know, maybe it's something that's kind of domain specific to managing things on a portal. You know, whereas like onos-config is a very generic, you know, data store that stores things in a generic format. Okay, so that's the subject of multi-tenancy. Then if you go on to the next slide, please, it's I think it's about hardening. Yeah. Oh.
Did it move? I was moved it like.
I think it might be my session has locked here. Yeah, a second.
See in the slide here, the hardening inserts.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just a second. So I have my system is locked up here, and I still have the phone, but I'm just going to connect again.
No problem.
Okay, bear with for 2 seconds.
Yeah, we don't want you to fly blind.
Yeah, trying to do it from memory could be a bit difficult. Yeah, hang on now. Let's see. Okay. Hopefully they can edit this out in the recording. So I think just to deal with the certs one first. So certificates is really they're needed for clients to connect over gRPC, and one check that is done is that the server's certificate comes from the same certificate authority as the client's certificate. So this is a check that happens automatically with gRPC, and then a second check that happens is the client will check that the server's certificate common name, or CN, is the same as its host name, and I think that's something again that's built in automatically to gRPC. There we go. That's better. So I think we need to put in some efforts in micro ONOS generally about how do we want to generate certs, and I know there are different approaches on Kubernetes for generating certs, and there are various tools and open source projects, and so I think that's really what I was getting here. Have a system of revocation and dealing with expiries and distribution and so on, because it's fine when we're working in our own world, but after that we go to a customer site and they'll want to install their own certificates. Okay. Let me see. I presume you can still hear me, okay?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. So one other thing I had was at the top, we need greater transparency on push failures. So this is basically, inside onos-config, I've seen the case where, it's trying to connect to a device and it retries, and there's like this back off mechanism to slow down the rate of retries and so on like this. But I think, the transparency of that needs to be brought back up to the user level. I want to see how many failed attempts and what was the failure cause, and, all of that kind of thing. And then recovery options, what do I do if it is telling me that it can't distribute to a device? What are the troubleshooting steps? What are my recovery options? How can I deal with those? The other thing that occurred to me was, should that kind of thing be sending up an alert? And I know the guys on the ops team have been looking at alerts from Rancher, and those onos-config need to send up alerts also if something goes wrong. Performance, security hardening, other things. For instance, Prometheus, do we need to gather statistics from onos-config and monitor its performance and so on like this? I don't know the answers to these questions. Really, I was just throwing it out there. And the search subject I've covered already. On the next slide, you can just, flick on there. Yeah, so basically the subject of adapters and mediators and synchronizers, and I think I didn't really know what to call it, but they're kind of things that come from XOS. We push downwards towards devices, but even on the northbound, is there a REST interface required? There's a tool called gRPC Gateway. It can expose basic gRPCs as REST, but it would need extra work for GNMI because the sub-level wouldn't be exposed on it necessarily. And we already have gRPC Web, which is a way of exposing GNMI and gRPC and everything like that to the GUI. So maybe gRPC web is something that can be reused on the northbound to give access to other applications. On the southbound, you know, GNMI is our interface on the southbound, but other methods, like if you want to, you know, to make a change through some other gRPC methods, you'll have to require an adapter, or for instance, netconf will require an adapter. You know, onos-config, the other point I wanted to make, it's really a distributed, validated store, and that's its two main characteristics. Is it's like it's distributed, it's got its atomic spec, it's validated by models. I suppose the other word I'd use there is it's a generic store. It can take any kind of data, but it's still not all things to all men, and so it doesn't do things like operations, alarms, KPIs, etc. like this. You know, that's an ONOS-ops thing, and that's something that hasn't even started yet as a microservice. And also, you know, it's not a general purpose synchronizer. Configurations aren't pushed up from a device into onos-config. I think that would have to be done through some northbound microservice that would receive configurations from below and push them into onos-config. But just a couple of caveats really on the structure of onos-config, and I think places we wouldn't like to change it.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly okay. I mean, there's definitely some changes like the RBAC or possibly the validation that would have to be kind of injected into the innards of the onos-config in order for it to have those capabilities. But a lot of the additional requirements can be implemented by surrounding, you know, onos-config with additional tools like adapters, for example. You know, the southbound adapters, it should all be just external. And I think likewise with the northbound adapter, it could very well be just external, and the, you know, the generic operations and things like that, again, external.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. On the next slide as well, like I have, oh no, sorry, did we skip one? I had one about initialization as well, you know, so you know, something needs to come along and basically you know, initialize onos-config, and if there is, you know, data to be synchronized from a device at startup when it connects, that's not something onos-config does at the moment. I think that would need another additional microservice to give that kind of functionality to us. Yeah, okay. So this slide then was Ray's. I don't know, Ray, do you want to cover this one?
Actually, Jordan.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, it was.
Yeah, so Ray and I were just talking about some of the technical debt that still exists in onos-config from when we left off. And from what I remember, there were some, so one thing is we took some API extensions out of the northbound API that we need to add back in for concurrency control. Like Sean was already mentioning, some of there's our sort of improvements that we can make to the failure and retry logic inside of the control loop. And there were some issues with reliability and efficiency of event delivery.
Okay, and then update,
yeah,
and then update the YGOT dependency IC.
Yeah, yeah. It seems to be changing rapidly, and they've gone from 6.x, you know, to 8.x, I think, in the past couple of months, and I expect them to go to 1.0 pretty soon. So, you know, we'll have to keep track of that one.
But I think that's actually good news, because that means the tooling is continues to evolve, and that means there is external investment in it, which means, you know, we made the right bet.
Yeah, it's great. It really is.
All right, I can talk to this slide. So when we, over the months, as we've been transitioning from onos-config to being working more on onos-ric, there were some structural changes that were made in the way we handle testing that broke things in config. Since we weren't actively using it, we just either took the code out or marked the test as skip. So that leaves us a little bit behind in terms of what coverage we had before. So Jordan, I know, has been wanting to add HA tests for a while. Currently, none of the testing behaves properly when we have multiple onos-config nodes. So that whole sort of area needs some work. We have a bunch of tests that are currently marked as skip. As I mentioned, these are both integration and unit tests. There have been some troubles with event delivery where 9 times out of 10 we'll get the right order of things, and then the 10th time either an event is dropped or it comes in the wrong order. I think Jordan has a pretty good idea of what's going on there. It might require some more changes to the innards, but we need to look into those. There are some latency problems where some tests just occasionally will take forever to run. We don't really know why. We have to loop back and take a look at that. And in general, the stream-based testing for things like subscriptions has been very brittle. Part of that is related to the event delivery stuff I talked about before. Part of it is just the testing infrastructure isn't really there to handle these asynchronous things. So we probably want to spend some time on that. We also have some unit tests that are marked as skip. I don't really remember why that was. I just remember that they were breaking the Travis build and we just didn't have time to go back and fix them. So we should either remove the tests if they're bad or hopefully fix them up to improve our coverage. And we also have a hole in that. So there are a bunch of tests that are testing sort of the northbound GNMI. So what they do is they make a change. They interrogate the device, which in these cases, the simulator, to see did the change happen. And then they interrogate the onos-config to see, is it telling me that the right change is there? There are issues with that portion of trying to interrogate the device. I think it's probably a bug in the infrastructure, but again, no one's been looking at it. We have to loop back and take a look at it. So that's
okay, well, thanks. I mean, I think this is all part of the fact we shifted focus heavily on SD-RAN. And so now that because we didn't have anybody immediately using onos-config, so now that we do, which is actually great, redirect some of the resources from this and yeah, and make it part of the Ether deployment.
Scott, then I think my question would be, does this kind of meet your needs, do you think, or is there something we're missing here?
Yeah, I think you covered all the basic points. I'd have to go back to the sort of priority task list that that we had in the ROC document. Maybe I can look in here. Migration was a big one. I assume that's just something we're going to talk about later, somewhat out of scope for the immediate. I think I made that as part of phase 2 as
yeah, so I think, so while we're on this subject, right, so I think what we probably need to do is kind of look at, I think this is kind of looking at onos-config from inside, from our, you know, kind of a viewpoint of where we know where some of the either limitations in terms of features or bugs are, and where we may need work on the internals. But I think it would be good to take a look at it kind of across the whole Ether use case, so potentially kind of from without, and be able to consider priorities in the order in which the use case will need it. And so we should probably have a discussion on how which things we need to tackle first and in what order.
Yeah, I mean, I think what one thing that could fall out of what we've discussed here today is that we create a set of issues on Jira, Ether issues, you know, to get some of this started and track it, and then, you know, as we deal with the others, we can add those as Ether issues as well.
Agreed. Yep.
Okay, I can start creating some of those later on, as long as I can find the right place to go. I think probably under ops really is where it should be, and probably give it a title of ROC or something like this, and then ROC onos-config, and then the description of what needs to be done.
Perfect. Yeah. So you and Scott can probably take a lead on this then and push it from within the ops team.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Sounds good. And then you can, Sean, then feel free to call on the resources of this team, right? Clearly, the expectation is not that you will do all the work yourself, right? Because we have others that can help. Clearly, Jordan, Ray, Adip can help as well. I mean, clearly, we don't want to divert all of the resources to work on this because we have to make sure we make progress on ONOS rig as well. But I think we can certainly, divert some and then because we need to consider the ether as a whole, and also the SD-RAN team. The nature of the tasks that we're dealing with is a little bit more nebulous, so I think there should be some holes kind of in the time that we should be able to fill with some of the work on this.
Yeah, that'll be great.
I would expect that I will be able to put forth some of my cycles toward implementation on these tasks as well. Not just design, but also implementation. It's going to take me a while to come up to speed on onos-config, but
that's okay. That's great.
Yeah, I'd love to do some coding and get involved. So yeah, I'll volunteer myself into this.
That's great to hear, because I mean, the more cross-pollination we can do, the better. I think that's good.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think we're a little bit past time, but not too much. So we can probably wrap this up. So thank you. Thank you again, Sean, for preparing this presentation and for thinking about it and getting it started. I'll post the recording of this meeting by the end of today and put it on the wiki. And I think the next meeting we actually have scheduled for next week because this one was shifted. So we'll post agenda for that in the coming days. So thanks again, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.